Welcome everyone. This talk is a part of, to kind of remind you, as you all know, but everyone, that this is a part of our Social Justice Fellows Lunchtime Seminars. We're closing the fifth one with a presentation by Koby Rogers. And the center is co-directed by myself and Pablo Silva from the Department of Philosophy. And the Social Justice Center is a center at Concordia University who's committed to encouraging social justice, facilitating transdisciplinary social justice research. We also support graduate student work in Concordia on social justice issues, and to that end, we offer graduate fellowships every year. We had 5 graduate fellows this year, and a part of that fellowship, we host a talk by them showcasing their research, followed by some kind of engagement, interaction that could benefit them with someone of their choosing on their topic. Today we will hear Koby Rogers Hall on relationships, aesthetics, and whatever happens next, which will be a performative presentation. Koby is a PhD student at Humanities at Concordia University, a part-time professor of theater, and a graduate fellow of the Social Justice Center. She's an artist and writer focusing on migrant justice and social arts practices. She is part of the artists block of the Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal, where she works in collaboration with Mostafa Henaway. And Mustafa, who's joining us today and will be a part of Koby's presentation, was actually a graduate fellow of the Social Justice Center in the past, so we're kind of building something here, I feel like. Back in 2019, and he's a PhD student at the Department of Urban Planning and Environment. I should know because I'm in his committee. He's also a longtime community organizer defending the rights of immigrant workers. So before I pass it on to Koby, we would like to remind ourselves and everyone else that we are on unceded indigenous territory. And we do not only acknowledge, but also encourage everyone to learn about indigenous issues and to support indigenous struggles of self-determination to actively resist colonialism and neocolonialism. And I will pass it on to Koby. Thank you.
So yes, hi, I'm Koby. We're figuring out the owl in the space. Hi, thanks everyone for being here. So we are in the active listening lab, which is on the 10th floor of the library building at Concordia. It's also one of the research labs I get to work with around oral history and transformative justice. So it felt creative in a way to just sort of bring you into a space where that experimentation can happen. Also, I do work in social arts practices, as most know as well, so sometimes it's just good to bring some of that into the field of research and remind myself and yourselves that those are forms of learning too. So thank you to the Social Justice Center for your support, also for co-hosting this talk. It's been an important touchstone to me because among my mentors, Mustafa kind of broke the way for activist work in PhD settings. And I would say it's pretty disorienting to be like inside and outside of institutions as we're often doing this work. So it's helpful to have community, a base among this year of peers and also the creative cohort here. So from folks online, I recognize some of you, thank you. And for myself, I'd like to include a visual description today, as we were reminded by one of our speakers last week. So I am a white presenting, blonde hair, glasses wearing a black dress. I have on a leather belt with some colorful ribbons attached that have yet to be detached. We're in a black box theater, and I have behind me a table with some ribbons, stones, different colored textiles. And we're all sort of spread out in the space today with medium lighting. Also, in terms of this work, and particularly my ongoing relationships with migrant justice, it is in tune and in learning with Indigenous sovereignty that there can be no migrant justice without Indigenous leadership in these causes. And so I too want to acknowledge that working from Choudry here in Kamienkahaga territories, these are the keepers of the Eastern Door, and they have been hosting me and many of our practitioners in these movements to come and movements to follow. So I have great gratitude and learning there, while recognizing that these are fields of contested knowledge and the university is a site of violence for many. So this is the paradoxes I operate from when I'm doing this work. Today I am talking, but also showing and feeling through relationships, aesthetics, which is sometimes the conversation about what is art and whatever happens next, because I think in a lot of movement work, we talk about prefigurative possibilities, the embodiment, the lived research, and also community engaged practice. So when leadership is coming from folks that you're working with, how can we and how do I follow really in the methods and in the activist learning that's already happening. So very appropriately, Mostafa Henaway is here with me today, because I've learned so much from him, mostly by doing stuff together. But as I'll speak to today, the introduction and the welcoming to the Immigrant Workers Center was very much through a learning and also testing capacity to really develop a language together before embarking on any kind of work. So without further ado, I have mostly a visual slideshow today that I'll do my best to describe, but I tried to not over prepare, that's my tendency. And Mustafa and I have decided to sort of have a conversation around some of these themes, so it'll be broken up with your wisdom and questions and maybe prompts for conversation from there. So here we go. I did mention that I'm working from Choudry, Montreal. Another reality is that I was born in the States on Abenaki territory near Vermont. And my parents, my mom here is in the center of the picture, were diplomats. So I grew up overseas, sort of moving from place to place. I am a grumpy white kid in the middle of a group of largely brown presenting children and one male presenting adult walking with them through what seems like a tropical setting. This is in Indonesia, most likely Yogyakarta to the best of my memory. But just an example of sort of the mixed paradox again of growing up in a diplomatic setting. So you're kind of dragged along, the privilege of being able to travel so young. And then also this is like my mom's field work, right? Any weekend or any trip involved work. And so I was also watching her do this work and also being in environments that were completely destabilizing, as I see later, for the better. But that's kind of my groundwork. And similarly, the caregiving in my family was shared by domestic caregivers. So this is Rosie, my other mother, I would call her. That's me as a baby. And Rosie, among two others, Filipina caregivers, were a big part of my childhood and basically lived with us from 10 to 15 years, part of the travel, but also this relationship, I think, that my mom had to feminism and humanitarianism at the time. This is the 80s, 90s, and also live-in caregivers. So these are the stages of the live-in caregiver program where they are at home with us and really a part of the family. But it also means that, this is how I'm being raised. And I think the question of whiteness to me becomes clear through difference and less through centrality, because I'm one of many in these contexts, and also learning through language and awesome food and love. So I'm really grateful for these contexts and also accountable to them. And so this is Rose Agmara is here, and she's still a part of our life. I interviewed her as part of an oral history project this past year, because I think there's a lot of revisiting to do on things we think we know as much as what we know. So that's a brief story to sort of acknowledge many years later, 20 years later, probably what I think brings me to the Immigrant Workers Center. You know, I have an artistic practice. I quickly moved into like political theater. But even though we're in a black box today, there's a lot about that in the art world that isn't enough, or that is not accessible, as we know, to many, whether we're in a university, whether it is an institution, do we have to pay, or it's withdrawn from the street? It really comes with this conversation about aesthetics and who's welcome. So part of arriving at the Immigrant Workers Center felt like, and as I reflect on it now, maybe the front end of this relationship to migration, and also as it transforms in the 21st century to what's happening with the importation of labor and the realities of these changing policies. And further to that, I think a cultural context and a dialogue where I feel most alive and aligned with maybe ways of making sense in the world that I listen to and also I feel conversant with. So through this work, we arrive at the Immigrant Workers Center in the artist block. Mustafa was one, this is in 2012, so Mustafa was a community organizer there, and maybe he'll tell us a bit more how the genesis of an art project happens, but he was among two organizers who welcomed me to the organization. And I say welcome with like a very worthy guardedness, because while there's a history of cultural practice at the Immigrant Workers Center, what is this legibility between an artist bringing their baggage and the center who very much has their campaign goals and so on? So the first thing we did, which I think made a big difference, was I volunteered. Like I was required basically to volunteer for the first 4 months before we even discussed any kind of workshop or artistic design, because there's the telling me how the center and the campaign works, but then there's so much about the ways of this worker center through meeting active members, through understanding language, the different working programs they're under, and really the realities of the day-to-day work, especially when you have a space. So what came through that, and I think this is a model that the center uses with a lot of its volunteers, is both a repositioning, like my understanding a bit more how any artistic facilitation relates to any of this work happening, but also a very clear delineation of where the leadership and voice lies in the center, which is absolutely its members, and with the support from a quite robust volunteer team. So after a couple of months, we arrive at the first sort of interventions of what would become the artist block. It's just a first series of workshops. But very much, and through the mobilization of the center, members and participants are bringing, their own skill sets. So this conversation again of decentering authorship, or who is the artist in this relationship. So we have like a world map that was being collectively sewn onto really a bed sheet, I think. But we would take it to us everywhere in the parks, and so the storytelling happens as people are threading. What you see here at center is their location. So many folks are going through Montreal to either their countries of origin or relationships to family around the world. And so the storytelling becomes also the building of this group and maybe some coalescing around that common but different experience. And I want to take a moment here to acknowledge some of the intimacies that become built when you're doing a direct action. This is a photo here of me and Carmelo, one of our founding members. We're doing an intervention at the Mexican consulate for the Ayotzinapa case of disappeared students and teachers. And so what's happening is you have this larger context. I mean, the way I think of it, you have the movement context, you have the institutional conflict in many ways. Then you have the site often where a public intervention is happening. And for example, here at the Mexican consulate, there's very much like police around, the representative trying to interact with the work, etc. But then you also have the live elements of what's happening, particularly in performance between people. So I remember this moment, and I think of it as a building of kind of longevity and collectivity when it comes to building a collective artistic voice. So why so much story is one of my quotes here, if you can see. Why do we take so much time for story? And I think we've spoken about this in other talks. I have a quote from Carmelo here, and it says, "We need to hear your story to understand the whole story of colonization." So any clear crisis that would come up as a white facilitator in this space early on in this project, with so much learning to do, became also a calling in and a requirement to participate as much as lead in what this knowledge base was going to be. And so I'm using ribbons today, and I've been working with ribbons in the last year because there's this continuity of both people, but also knowledge in our lives as we move forward. And the weaving of that feels like something I want to keep working with. Before I pass it over to Moose, who has lots to say about this story, one more element I wanted to welcome is the water and stones that I've shared in the room. So you all have, for those online, if you have water in your space or you'd like to grab a cup of water, one of the things that this draws on, so both for Carmelo and many Indigenous leaders that have migrated or been displaced, is, as we've spoken to, the relationship to land and also the defense of land and water, as we know. And so while we're all tied to place and water and stones, there's also, through the work of Leanne Simpson and much of Anishinaabe thought, the idea that we're all here to cast a stone. And whatever your contribution, whatever your small mark in that project or that movement may be, if the ripple effects that you have no idea where that's going to carry, that becomes part of this body of water in that story. So as a method, I invite you, whenever it feels right, to cast a stone into a body of water and watch what the wider concentric circles tell you in terms of their effects. So with that, I'd love to invite Mustafa for any of his thoughts about the IWC and how we met.
However you're comfortable.
Do you want to sit, stand, or?
Whatever's best for the owl.
Yeah. There, they got you.
Okay. So, my name is Mostafa Henaway, and I've been a community organizer at the Immigrant Workers Center since 2007. So when I first moved to Montreal, or just shortly after when I moved to Montreal, and have been there since, and I can't seem to leave. And sort of speaks to the place and sort of what it means to me. And I guess the Workers Center really began as a project to deal with the gaps. I mean, in a way, to deal with the gaps that, and as a fault line of sort of capitalist globalization at that time, right? That there were many people who were beginning to migrate more and more. And also as a result of sort of economic restructuring here, we're not unionized. We're not part of the labor movement, who are coming increasingly as temporary foreign workers, as live-in caregivers, as seasonal agricultural workers, and we're facing a whole host of issues that the labor movement wasn't addressing, right? And couldn't even speak to them, even in attempts when there were these sort of union drives, because the two founding members, Tess and Marco, were from the Philippines and were labor organizers in the trade union movement. And unions weren't interested in sort of creating a space that would be friendly to them, that would be able to bring them in, that would be able to deal with the issues they face. So it was really a small project kind of to deal with those particular issues. So the center really began as a way of creating a space in the community that could deal with immigrants' labor issues, right? And it started off small. It started off mostly with working with live-in caregiver workers, doing campaigns against their deportations, or around access to health and safety, because only until now, just this year, when you're a live-in caregiver worker, you didn't have access to health and safety because the home is not a workplace, quote unquote, under the law. So even though these people, and the issues that they face, and also at that time, lots of people were beginning to, there was an irony. So the center sort of grew and expanded, and one of the things that we began to work on was actually with a lot of textile and garment workers. And so as the whole industry was kind of collapsing, in front of people's feet, and actually, people were actually packing, their sewing machines to the countries where they migrated from, right? Like that was the irony of what was taking place, and you know, to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka, to Pakistan, and so, you know, we began to work with, you know, textile and garment workers, and now we work with, you know, we have a whole host of committees where we try to deal with, you know, sort of the structures or the pillars of precarity, right, in terms of the way migration has changed in the use of temporary migration now as a key means, and we see that with Legault, you know, dealing with the issues that many more people are now without, you know, permanent status or undocumented, but even those who are permanent residents who are working through temp agencies and working now at sort of these, you know, the choke points, right? So, you know, in warehouses and distribution centers, right, which my research is more related to, you know, so when we think about Amazon and we think about, so a lot of the centers empowering and trying to build the base of people who are often deemed marginal, but are actually at the centers of our economy, right, and have immense power, and that's why they're marginal. So really the center is about trying to find ways to build their collective power because they're outside of the labor movement.
Thank you. So following on that, I can get back in. This is sort of fun because we just came up with this format yesterday, and it reminds me that unofficially or officially, I don't know if you'd agree, Moose, but you were co-facilitating the artist block with me. I mean, very much as we arrived to what the project would be, thinking through that structure, also an infrastructure of leadership and sustainability became how can a community organizer existing at the center who is on board with the project, because I think you needed enthusiasm, also require some of the grant money, because it was a funded project, to run towards their contributions to this collective and also to the knowledge sharing that they're bringing from the center. And so I think that was intrinsic also both to my development of an artist. And so again, I have to give you thanks for that, for all this work, but also to the buy-in, right? Like people seeing themselves, like what is this for at the center? How is it my space? So those were pretty key placeholders for that work. Which brings us to this conversation of aesthetics, which we may again often think of as an art space or a gallery, or believe me, in the PhD, like who's writing about aesthetics, who decides about beauty, ugliness, authorship. Here we have a picture, so this is maybe 3 years into the Artist Block project, 2014, 15 about, it's a $15 campaign. Some of its earliest, largest actions, I would say. So for those of you who don't know, in Quebec, at the time, probably still, but catching up to it, mobilizing for a minimum wage of $15 as just the basic living wage was considered ambitious and contestatory at the time. We now know it should be much higher, but the work that the center did, particularly in mobilizing this coalition contre le travail précaire, so against precarious work, was again bringing to the forefront, this is even just the head of the demo, those marginalized and vulnerable workers that constitute the Immigrant Workers Center. And so something very simple that we have here, which is like a papier-mâché giant 15, is at the head of the march. And the things I just want to like point out, so this is clearly, you know, a demo photographer, someone's doing the documentation, but the 15 is front and center. We're on Saint-Hubert Street in Villeray in Montreal. So it's capturing like the eyesight of everyone coming by. And most important to me, or compelling, is the joy on the faces of the people carrying it. So there's like this visibility and also contagion that is happening, like yes, with art in public spaces, but also like this mirroring effect of like you're being seen, you're seeing people, and it's coming through with a simple enough action that takes up space. And that has been a big part of community mobilizing as much as these artistic strategies, I think. How do they match and in a way elevate each other to this exponential way? So one of our members who's seen here, Manuel, also doing a PhD at the time, so there's a lot to be said about activist research, started to bring up what we were already doing, which in his words were the aesthetic of resistance. Whether there's a school for this or not, what the Artist Block was bringing in his words and in his thoughts is kind of the look, but also the aesthetic to these mobilizations that allow for things like reproduction. You start seeing like red 15s everywhere, that allow for things like appropriation in the positive sense of the word. Anyone can slap that red 15 on their shirt. And another thing that it allows for, which I think was a big part of our work, well, so here you see kind of flyers that are handed out for future demos where the same images are reproduced, but also the process of making such a thing. And so we did kind of this collage of how many days and how many people and how many hours go into making a giant papier-mâché project, which is what the image represents here. Many, many, many shots of a collective sculpture, which also comes from puppetry traditions, right? And the idea that, so we're showing the work, but we're also making it together. And I came back to this in preparing the presentation because I think, and as I came to learn more from the project, that this is the aesthetic as much as anything. So what we're showing in public, but also what's happening, not just when people are working together, but this particular configuration of folks from different migrant backgrounds, different labor status, and the hours that this takes makes for the conversations and the discourse of the movement and the branding, if you will, of what a social movement will be, but through the eyes and the participation of folks involved. So I think that that aesthetic of resistance becomes a conversation as much about what it means to make art together in this context with these participants. And I don't totally remember what images I have. Oh, here's Carmelo again. So not one more deportation. Here we are, at the Trudeau Airport in Montreal, where another action is happening in combination with solidarity across borders. You have security presence behind, and then again, total joy and elation of sort of like claiming space, reconstituting, in this case, private spaces, but at the site of deportations for so many. So when I come back to this question about aesthetics, and particularly in PhD research, of course, there's so much written from a Eurocentric perspective and the westernizing conversation philosophically about what aesthetics are. And Rolando Vasquez, more contemporary, writing in conversation with Walter Minulo, talks about decolonial aesthetics, reminding us that it's an experience, it's what we feel, it's what we sense, and that you are using a multiplicity of faculties that do not necessarily center Western thought. And so really when we're talking about aesthetics, we're talking about the colonial difference between who's reading, who's representing, and how are we making legible these practices. And so I think about that, or I'm drawing on it when it comes back to how this decentering and also making apparent that colonial divide in terms of artistic production serves anti-colonial struggles in the migrant justice movement. As we speak about with Henaway, and has happened so much in this artist space, if world making becomes the resistance, then these relationships and the production of these works are the visibility and the tenability that's going to sustain sort of these actions moving forward. And so that brings us to clashes with institutions, because while we're still using some of the tools that you'll see for demos with both artistic practices like posters, photography, graphic design, of course, we've had so many amazing graphic designers working with us, you also have this dance between institutional spaces, funding, and production. If you're getting funding from, well, I guess they weren't exactly public funding. We're always confused, like, is this public or private foundation? So, absolutely take it and then try to redirect it through, in our case, the center or some of these productions. But there's always this debt almost that comes up between, like, what do you owe to the people who are supporting the project, or what do you owe to your audiences, even as an artist? And while ethics is a really important and overwhelming topic in the academic and research creation sector, there's kind of a flip that can be said when it comes to some of these works eventually over the 7 years being shown in art galleries or being shown in, there's one residency that we did in a shopping mall. So there's so many ideas about the host of how this work should be read or framed that were in complete contradiction with the members. Something as simple as cultural mediation, which, if you're not familiar as a field, and it's very strong in Quebec, is often there's a representative or a translator who literally will stand between the artist and the public to interpret the artwork. And in so many ways, particularly in line with direct action, with the relationships that we were talking about, that would interrupt the very purpose and mobilization of this artistic action, which is to put these migrant organizers and artists in direct conversation, interaction with families, white Montrealers, French Quebecois, etc., which is the radical act unto itself. So it's not always a straight road, and if anything, working with cardboard, getting these messages through, bringing your kids to the show was as much a part about reclaiming the framing of these works as it was about survival and creating from that place. And so before I bring it back to Mustafa to hear your thoughts on that artistic practice, and maybe it's time for one of these, I don't totally remember all the quotes that are here, so we'll see what this one has to say. Ah, there you go. The sharers understand what is not shared between them, and that's Audre Lorde. So this idea of difference also became the site of creation for so many participants, as we saw with the map, but also the points of intervention around this neo-colonial migration reality. As local as Quebec to often broader movements across the country. So how do I try and bring this back into the PhD? It's a conundrum. Oh, here are some of the aesthetics before we get to that about what would be presented in a mall context, and the classic others coming in and saying, well, how is this art versus an archive versus reproducing someone else's collection? So these are images from the Ayotzinapa representations that would happen. The banner in the middle would be, a tool that we had in a demo brought inside, and you saw someone listening to audio, so people's interviews, commentary on the artworks were included. It's not for lack of a turnout, and if anyone would think who's turning out, this is in the Côte des Neiges Mall, so it was very successful for passersby, but also to have a place to occupy for 6 weeks and really bring your community, your families to both celebrate, which when we're talking about art is how are you reviving and nourishing these movements, as well as to organize direct action and strategies. For example, there was a procession that came out of this space and took over the mall. And again, our hosts were like, whoa, this isn't what we were talking about when we said art intervention. So back to occupying space, this is one of my interventions in the last 2 years in here, the Active Listening Lab. And so different things that I've been grappling with, particularly like so many of us with the pandemic and parenthood, as I noted, becoming like a limited set of resources to still find some continuity with the person that I've been and that I was, is how can this research so be embodied and also remain like vigilant or contestatory of the conditions that it's happening in. So you're seeing some of the same elements that I had today, which are ribbon with quotations on it. Here you have the water and the stones, but on a projector, sort of pointing back at the viewer. Well, it's not perfect, it was an experiment. The idea was sort of like the looking and looking back, right? And this is happening in a wider context for research creation at the Active Listening Lab, but how do you bring in that engagement with while also just being very clear on your position and always remembering that there's a relationality there. So that's something I'm still grappling with, and I think when it comes to this model of art and migrant justice is, always coming back to whose community knowledge for and in what context is it appropriate, because in others it may be a completely different set of tactics that comes to work. Steph, I'd love to hear from you on that. We spoke about maybe other source projects that come to mind or current practitioners at the center too that are carrying on this work.
No, I mean, definitely, I think like art was a way and remains a way that like allows people, I mean, at the center, it plays like a pretty important role, like for us, when we do, a lot of our, artwork gets ending up tied to being able to allow people to actually share their stories, right? So it's a way of being able to give them sort of their humanity in a way that you couldn't to a broader audience, because, you know, when people, let's say, are interviewed in the media, they're just often, you know, the subjects, there's like a quote and that's it, or oftentimes many of our members, you know, no one invites them to give, you know, a talk or a lengthy, so it's a way of being, I mean, back to Carmel's thing, allowing people to express their stories, right, in a way that's, I mean, that's dignified, but then also in a way that gets them to participate in building their own collective self. And that was, you know, a big thing about the artist block, right? It wasn't about what was produced at the end, but it was about like the whole process, right? It was one of the few spaces at the center where people felt that they could just, they came back and back and back, right? And there was a kind of a consistency there, because it wasn't the drudgery of minutes and meetings and what will we do next, right? It was about just trying to create something together. And I think to me that was a big part of it, in terms of being able to also then build the leadership of the center too. It was, you know, people like Carmelo or Neil. Neil's you know, now a full-time organizer at CAP, Committee Axiom Park Extension, and was an organizer at the center, and Manuel's still very involved, and you know, people like Inti, even though she's back in Mexico, still plays like a big role, you know, with everyone. And so there was a way of building a sense of community, and, you know, and even when we think about, you know, like the production of things too, right? At the end, it's Mayworks is always, you know, our cultural event, you know, it's mostly every year, you know, there was the exception of the pandemic, but is like our biggest event, and it comes and it's the art practice from people, and also when you use, I don't know, there's something about, you know, I think since the artist block, trying to use art more, not just as, you know, come look at art, but art as like, you know, as a way of protesting, as a way of you know, keeping the spirits up. So I mean, and that's something that, you know, street theater, you know, constantly in our demos, right? And even bringing a lot of the props still to a lot of our rallies, right? The big 15 or the big boot or the phantom agency, right? There's still things that we still use to this day, or the I forget what we call
Like
it.
a puppet?
No, the women's puppet. The women's.
Yeah, so another giant puppet was created collectively through a women's group of temporary agency workers.
Yeah.
And for me, it's super fun as an artist to like see it in a demo and be like, oh, because it takes on a different life every time, right?
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, there's an element too where I think maybe there's just different, I mean, and watching now sort of this continuity, you know, we have an organizer, Gurav, who was a temporary agency worker at Dollarama warehouse, but, and he's a refugee claimant, but he was a celebrated theater artist in India, right? And, you know, here his position completely changed, and he did political theater against the BJP, and, you know, around women's issues and around unemployment and corruption. And so he brought that tradition here, right? And like, and because, you know, because of the Workers Center, because of the artist block, there is that kind of space, right? Where in movements, unfortunately, I don't want to make a essentialist argument, but in the West, it's sort of, you know, artists here and it's very professional, and then movements are just kind of dry and boring, and they're here, right? And but in the global, you know, but in lots of parts of the global south, that's not the case, right? Like, and so being able, you know, to do that here, to bring those traditions here into it, it changes everything, right? You know, when Gaurav is just shouting at people at a demo in his theater way, you know, it really, it engages people, right? And so, and you don't see that in a lot of other demonstrations, right? We're just angry, right? And we're supposed to be angry all the time. And then we are still angry, but
Serious.
yes, yeah. And so I think to me that's a real key part of the artist block is it, and you know, it built a sense of community, but it's also built a kind of different tradition too, right? Or it's drawing on like those traditions that in places that you don't sort of, you know, are not frowned upon, but are sort of you know, held back. you know, and people don't have those engagements, and I mean, also people don't have those histories too, right? So, and I think we were able to, the artist block brought something from people's histories into the way that we could do things here, so.
And we were talking yesterday, because I was a bit of prep, of this idea of a bottle effect, of if you call something community art, or if you call, you know, if you ghettoize something as like world music, what is really happening to sever? Yeah, one, it's a reframe, as you know, but two, it's really a containment that mirrors, I think, the conditions that the migrant justice movement, again, and essentialism, but as I witnessed it, pushing back against, which is that one, these categories don't represent us, and two, that there's a violence and an intention behind them that tries to reproduce itself through the aesthetics and even the understanding of what cultural reproduction is. So it becomes a really exciting space for individual liberation and I think collective liberation work as well. Trying to bring that into the university is, you know, something that I am mindful of. So what would happen next? Great question. More events like this, sort of as we heard last week, you know, I'm in year 2 of my PhD in research creation. Feels like there's a lot of exams and reading right now, which is good to sort of think about how do we, you know, operationalize this knowledge in a way that works, that we're accountable to, and also reminds us, you know, we're not alone. As you were talking with stuff, I remember this one. I'm pretty sure, we'll see if I can untie it, that it's about pleasure and remembering, you know, if we agreed to be in this space for whatever amount of time, it's also to remember pleasure and knowledge, and that is part of the work. So Adrienne Marie Brown, Pleasure as a Medicine. I think when you're talking about anger in movements, anger is the other side of grief. And so if we can nourish the fire or the water of these feelings, then we're also sustaining our families and our friends over the long term, so that those emotions have breadth too, and we can be full people, instead of what may be called as like the soldier activist or the resilient migrant story, the ever-serving community organizer, etc. So this is again an image from that residency in the shopping mall. And what I'm thinking of is, you know, and what much literature out there about is a relational archive. So one that is coming through the relationships of folks that understand one another, that are testifying to both, as kind of as Mustafa was just describing, the works that were produced, but also how they were made, what it meant in context, and this ripple effect, if anyone wants to see what that looks like, of, you know, not just casting the stone, but also what may come from that. We have no control over it, yet we are a part of. And I think that I'm as interested and about what that means for the center and for organizers here in Montreal as it is for this context, as you're highlighting, that already exists and is out there for, we can call it artistic activism and engaged practices, but decolonial strategizing around representation, around movement organizing, and how, for myself, these conversations about trauma, grief, and loss have a space, and also are honored in movement work as the fire, as the substance that will also carry us through to potentially changing these conditions. What does that mean for an archive? We were speaking yesterday about a series of events, once again. You know, what does it mean for folks that are no longer with us? We have Carmelo, who passed over the last 2 years, which was a big loss for our organization. We have Aziz Choudry here, telling us that it's our perverse sense of humor that keeps us alive. So where are these spaces that, you know, we're honoring our elders, folks that passed, become elders to us as well, and also they're with us. And coming back to that photo we saw of everyone working together, I mean, these relationships are as much the substance of this activist knowledge and of this legacy as our, you know, whatever authorship or text or writing about this work. So in the field of oral history, but also in creative activism, it becomes not necessarily a reconstitution of that, but a dynamic, moving, relative archive, I guess, that could either exist online, in person, but also through the revisiting and renewal of specific artistic strategies in these contexts. And so it becomes an intergenerational conversation as much as it becomes like a positioning and a really claiming of this moment, the artist block at the Immigrant Workers Center being seminal and also influential, I think, for Workers Center organizing and for larger artistic accountabilities in neoliberal context. So the mechanisms of this are to be worked out, but it feels like that is the work, that is the walking while not knowing, as Carmelo would tell us from Zapatismo ethos, and that is through some of these mistakes and failures and pushbacks that I've definitely received in the research creation program, that again, the realities of surveillance and conflict will be part of the work and not necessarily something that's left behind. That we're always reminded of the colonial context in which it's happening, and also the potential creativity, resiliency, and listening that leads to not owning the work, but owing to one another. So Mustafa, you may open the conversation from here. Thank you for joining us. But I think, yeah, as activist researchers, I'm really interested in hearing if the PhD is us leveraging within institutional resources, then what can our interventions be to either continue this work or subvert it for the goals of the movements, communities we're working, while staying agile and joyful in our struggle. This is what I'd love to talk with you about. Thank you so much. If you wanted to add something to get the conversation going, we can, or we can see if in the chat and folks here I can leave us with Alexis Pollingum's "Fugivity requires being present." As much as I may want to run away, I stand here and I have to be here, and with all that's changed and with all that remains, the work starts here.
Can you, do you want me to take care of that?
I would love it if you don't
Okay,
mind.
hold on.
Hi, everyone. We're going to bring you in.
I haven't worked with a Mac in a long time. How do you make it full screen? Did you make the sound test with the
I did. Nisa
people?
was saying the sound was fine, and again, anyone can let us know if there's sound issues. Nisa or Varda.
Great.
Um,
I have a question.
yeah, great.
Start us off.
I was wondering about the process in the, I was wondering about the process in the artist block. So when you're starting a new project, how does the idea come? How do we decide? What's the decision-making process around an artistic project? Is there like a lead? Is it always the same person, or is it like different people? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think as part of the study, those will be things that I'll be tracking, and also how they move, kind of like we were talking about, that the archive is not being something static. I think that's true of these projects as well. It's important to say that the artist block, I don't think the word is over, but it's bracketed in the form that it was 2019, I guess, both because of people sort of dissipating and then the pandemic and all the compilations, and the artistic work continues. So I think what becomes interesting about that question are the mechanisms, as you say, for either initiative or buy-in. I'm always interested in if like someone brings something and then people jump on board, like what does it take, or what are a couple tries there to get people to claim this project and really carry it forward. So for some of the particular campaigns, I think, and Liz could speak to this, that the center would kind of be like dropping ideas because there was a need, or at least a timeline for demos and campaign objectives coming up. But many of our major projects, to be honest, like the Metro map that you saw, came from a member who'd been thinking about this. And this is where building confidence over time, I think, becomes, like, if the conversation in the beginning was, I'm not an artist, why would I join this workshop? The conversation later on becomes like, hey, have you all seen this project? Or this is from my own town, or I brought a poem that I wrote and let's do some scenes based on that. So there's really an evolution, I don't want to say in confidence because I think it was already there, but of interest to me is really relationally changing the terms of what counts and who can start this conversation and who's listening.
I think, I think what Mustafa said about like this kind of this barrier about like this is the field of politics or kind of institutional and like kind of physical spaces of like talking about politics, and that's like minutes, very serious, kind of it's organized in a different way. And then like there's also kind of the institutional spaces of like doing art, especially in let's say Eurocentric or like global north kind of ontologies. But I think it's kind of like what doing art brings in to a movement. And I think it's, yes, it's different in the global south, but I think like that, especially separation of art and like what counts as art is pretty similar in the global south too. But for instance, eating together, cooking together, like sharing parts of life that are not kind of politics is a lot more kind of inherent, I feel like, in the global south, partly because of that kind of social ontology of like how the world is kind of organized. But I think to a certain extent, it's still kind of, I feel like, an explicit strategy for movements to include that part of like the reproduction of life. I mean, like art is kind of, as you really kind of both of you explain, it's also kind of bringing in your tradition, talking about home, kind of sharing stories in a way that kind of more strictly organized field of doing politics does not, or like doing kind of labor politics does not allow. And I think it's no coincidence that a lot of, for instance, migrant solidarity kitchens are kitchens, because I mean, that was what I've done in Turkey. That's how I kind of, my second wave of politicization in 2011 was I became a part of a solidarity kitchen, migrant solidarity kitchen. And that's kind of, when you go around, especially in Europe, it's an intentional choice because there's such a kind of an unbridgeable difference, you know, social difference and like more between kind of the European anarchist youth and like the migrants, right? So unless you start doing something together, that could be an art project, that could be cooking things. So unless there's some form of collective labor beyond campaigning, like actually that is kind of towards the reproduction of life, really, that kind of difference is, there's no way to bridge it with like words or like campaigns. So when you start doing things to reproduce yourself as a community together, that really creates like relations of egalitarianism. Like that's what constitutes like community, and that like I think that resonates a lot. So I was gonna say, I think there's like a parallel there, but also like, do you know anything? This is just curiosity, and anyone can have ideas. Any other movements who uses art, like, or kind of what's like the story or history of like arts and movements, and not like political art, but like really kind of grassroots movements adopting kind of art in the way that you are describing. Right? Do you want to jump in, or?
No, I mean, around the reproductive and sort of the collective labor and building a sense of egalitarianism, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I mean, to me, I think food, I think is like a really big part of it that gets sort of frowned upon, whether it sometimes could be bringing it from somewhere else, sometimes it's not so collective, but I mean,
Yes,
sometimes.
of course.
But I mean, I think, you know, especially when you're, you know, building a sense of community, I mean, a lot of the times, I think especially in migrant justice, and I think there's a lot of naive views that people are always, that that people are inherently or naturally organized, right? So even labor active, there's always this thing, you find a leader calls a bunch of people, and then things happen, right? Or that, you know, we even use the word, you know, we use the word community, right? Like there's a natural organization, but for a lot of people, I think especially for immigrants and migrants, it's actually the opposite, a deep sense of isolation.
Yeah.
Right, and that's structural, right? Like that's not because of who they are as individuals, they've already left they've already been displaced and left their homes, and then, people are working 10, 12 hours, 14 hours a day. And so there's also a sense of like they don't have and so they don't have that sense of community, right? And like that and that collective labor, I think, is a big part of and why people are involved, I think, in a different way, right? Why there's this constant sort of base of people willing to mobilize, right? And that, I think, a part of it is what you said, right? Like the collective labor, even in some advanced, in Japan, I think it's Tokyo, was with the precarious young workers union, and a lot of them even felt so isolated that one of their big activities is to make sushi together after they do flyering. Which was pretty cool to actually to hear about. So I mean, I think and then it sort of dissipates power within that,
Yes,
because
definitely.
everybody is in it together. There's no one can dictate the terms of like.
Yeah, you cannot say, you do the sushi I want. I mean,
You can try.
You can try, but like, no,
And your
it
tools.
definitely is like a different way of coming together, and
Yeah.
like, kind of, where like, you can be a very kind of seasoned organizer and or, I don't know, educated and like speak languages, but like when it comes to the kitchen, you're like a piece of crap, maybe. So, and like, yeah, you have to do it, like you have to cut onions for like 3 hours maybe.
Yeah.
So, and like that's manual, like, so that there's like a different rule, kind of a principle of like organizing labor too, that could be. So I think, and I mean, everything kind of, why I ask, for instance, if you know of any other movements or like, how is it? Because art was such an important part of like so many grassroots movements, especially anti-gentrification, kind of anti-urban transformation in Istanbul prior to the 2013 uprising. I mean, and it was like communities against gentrification from neighborhoods coming together with artist collectives, coming together with radical architects and urban planners in spaces and using art in every protest in a way. And like one, for instance, thing that came out of it is against the biennial, there was, I mean, it was partly funded by this huge like a capital, like conglomerate, and which also happened to be the one that supported the 1980 coup d'etat, and like wrote to the military dictator that they've done really well because all these workers were like getting out of hand. So like, we thank you, we thank you, General, like as like the largest domestic capitalist group in Turkey. He wrote a personal letter, and his group was in part funding, supporting this biennial, and which was kind of supposed to be critical and like asking about like urban transformation and everything. So this conglomerate of artists, architects, and neighborhood assemblies, they started distributing this postcards that looked identical to tickets to the biennial, just had like this one note, like peel. And when you peel, the letter that this capitalist wrote to the general 30 years ago would come out. So it's like, it was like, it's also kind of bringing in, like, it's not like, it's also kind of bringing the spectator into the practice of like revealing an information, which was to this day, I think, like for me, one of the most kind of impressive acts of like using art, but also the project itself kind of started a kind of a coalition between different groups who were fighting against similar things in a way that we wouldn't be otherwise. So it's again the collective labor part that actually kind of forged that that alliance or solidarity in a way.
Yeah, I'll just complete, if I can, the collective thinking with Moose of, for sure there's a giant field of arts activism out there, and
Right.
even one of my fields is art history, and I'm like, oh God, how do I bracket it? Because you not necessarily have to become a specialist, but get closer to what the aims of these questions are. And I think some of the things that you're pointing to, so institutional critique, we see with the Tate Modern activism is going in and sort of naming that the funding is coming from these big oil companies, or Take Back the MoMA artists themselves are saying, like, if we can't even afford the tickets anymore, what does it mean to kind of push back against these spaces and democratize them. But this question of social practice, which is one of my field, is an interesting one, because it's also an institutionalizing, it's like giving a name, creating a discipline out of the social reproduction that you're talking about. And a lot of the writing pushback tensions that become, like, I get shivers because they're super constructive, I think, between activist spaces, artistic spaces coming together is both this, like, when you get subsumed by the system or the artistic institution, but also when you were talking about social reproduction, like what's really happening with the labor on these projects, like who's getting paid, who gets credit, for where it's being shown, and these things that can seem sort of minor or banal of like, oh, well, that's art, it's not about me, or as you were saying, oh, that's a funder, we'll just take the money and run, are part of bigger projects that are still around colonial representation, privatization of public spaces. That's why anti-gentrification is so tied up in it, and racial politics, absolutely. So my particular interest, and I think owing to the migrant justice leaders and teachers that I've had, is what is specifically happening in this context that belongs to the ethics and relationships in this movement, and is also challenged by artistic strategy that can come to open up some of these gaps or these irreconcilable differences, as you say, that are part of what I see as the reality in some. It's not about we're not going there. It's like we're already here. What are we doing relationally, interdisciplinarily, systemically to whether it's status for all, equity for participants, and also, in my own case, really decentering whiteness on any front that can happen, because it's already here. The realities that we're living in, it's kind of like the death of neoliberalism and the painful death of old white guys is it's just trying to pull us all down with it, as I've seen. So the prefigurative possibilities, the also points of conflict between these disciplines, I think become an interesting edge that is why I stay true to kind of what they offer one another. As you were saying, we did one bread making workshop with Mustafa because he's always posting this amazing bread that he makes, and again, you can call that art, and there's this conversation always while you're making food. But I think many of the things you described were part of the fun of it, that the community organizer was hosting all of us in his house. You have to get messy, so that's the method. And someone's bread will be great, and someone's will be interesting, but again, the conversations, the relationships, to be able to do some of those direct actions where people have a different stake and risk in it is also about caring for one another. And so I think getting better at caring for one another and listening is a big engagement in this work.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen in circles only. It happens through that, and that's, I think, is a very, very valuable, I think, kind of knowledge that has been filtered through years and kind of invented through movements, that it's words and certain we need certain rituals and labor to actually constitute equality or non-hierarchization. Yeah.
I think Leah has a question before me. I can go after you.
And I
Well,
don't
no,
know
it's-
if we need to check on the chat.
Yeah, it's okay.
Thank you.
I was just reacting on what you had said during your talk, Koby, about who are we doing the art for? And then your conversation just now, the three of you, of, caring for each other and listening. And I'm sure you already do this. It made me think of the purpose perhaps of even the art inside the artist block is not necessarily exporting anything, but creating art for the validation of the people already there. And sort of one thing you said, Mustafa, about this guy who's Indian, who's like this actor, right? And there is this big thing, because I was working with the Rwandan community in Montreal who emigrated after the genocide, during the genocide, and they also have this similar narrative of like, we were like high standing people and we arrive here and no, like we're not recognized for who we were, and there's a sort of self-worth thing, and so it's also nice to have these spaces where it's like, no, we give you the opportunity to revitalize those skills and revitalize your self-worth, and we validate you in that, yes, you are, right, yes, you are an actor. It's not because you work at a Dollarama that you're not an actor.
Sure.
So I guess I'm sure you guys do this, right, of like doing that, like getting funding to make art projects, but it's just for us. Like it's not to be exported, right? The goal is just, let's put on a theater production for us, right? Or let's,
Yeah. I don't know, I mean, like,
Yeah.
how funding works when you think of it, it's all tied to like deliverables and like, so like I wish like there was, I guess like you have to show
well,
something.
you could say it's for mental health and empowerment. I mean, I guess it's maybe charged words, and I'm not sure how the funding works in the art business, but, and I mean, I'm gonna say something really contentious, so whatever. But you can always bullshit for their money. You can always bullshit, right? Like you can always say, yes, we're gonna do this and this
No,
and this.
I mean, of course, and I think it's a part of I think it's tactical, and I think it could be great, like, I think you, like, and there are like also movements, groups who do this, like, they apply for funding, not to bullshit, like, not bullshitting in the sense of like, oh, we're gonna do this, but like, this one group that I used to work with, the Recommon, based in Rome, would get money. Basically, the main activity they were getting money for was to reveal corporate dirt. And like, so, and but like that was kind of a part of the transparency and like good business and stuff, kind of the neoliberal European discourse. But what they would do was to systematically kind of put aside money, then to hold events just for like movements they were working with, just to like every year they would put together movements, especially in Italy, working, and like they would just like have a conversation, like, okay, what are you doing? What can we do? Like more abstract and kind of more on the ground. And for arts too, I guess like there's always a way to like work around that funding, but also, I mean, it's just like the funding works in a way that is like,
Yeah, you always need to be
and it's like a
accountable
super
to
dissociative kind of process to
Writing
package your
reports.
works like that way, in a way. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the only contrast I would provide, and again, it's a big takeaway from my work at the center, is, with this great tradition and lineage of oppositional art making, there's great stalwarts of, organizing political thinking, whether it's Marxist, Leninist at the center duking it out, or whether it's these frustrations with one another. It's sort of like we have an affinity and we're also not enough or not totally versant in the language of whatever other community. So I would actually say that many of the longer term members in the project were calling for direct action and reminding us, okay, but how is this getting that person out of the deportation center? Or I'm tired of being one in the middle of the stage. This is where it gets interesting, I think. How can the way we design this participatory work literally pull someone on stage to the point that they have the mic and stay there long enough that they might actually want to keep talking? So this idea of using it as a tool as much for funding, like I would say our record sessions were staged performances. If there was ritual work between us, I would say it's the care work. There was a lot of debriefing happening, for example, like as an activist tool. I think that really could be done more in artistic settings, because we're not just taking for granted, a lot of this performance work is bodies as material. And it's like, yes, and we're still people too. And race on stage is experienced, you know, through the eyes of whoever's viewing you, and security risks are different for everyone there. So it's more how these work together that I think create a really unique and leverageable field, because that's where it gets exciting when we were at the edge of what either know. Like the center didn't exactly have the answer. Members knew what they wanted to do, and you know, artistic practices could go so far in designing it. But then the space of like what's going to happen when we do it, that is the field of really specific service to these goals. And then it's documented afterwards. But again, to what end? We were talking about who's the documentation for.
Exactly, so that this is exactly my question, because I was thinking about what are you doing to archive this work? Because when we're trying to think about the role that the university could play there, I was wondering if you were in contact with archives here at Concordia or another university to help keep the memory alive, but also to archiving these kinds of art practices also make these migrant workers part of a Quebec history, legitimate part of Quebec history, and I think it's really important to, in general, archiving of social movement. Most social movements are really bad at archiving their work, so I was wondering, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think where it's useful, and I feel like part of my being accountable to PhD is like really owning what can be leveraged and what can be in service to these goals. So, you know, there's an entire field of study around archive as imperialism, and where the ways that we document things, again, could organize knowledge in a certain way, just by categorization, or language is a big question in this field, or even some of the photographs that we were looking at when I spoke about aesthetics, like things are framed in a certain way with a certain goal in mind. So 2 parts. What's beneficial at the university, I think, is people like geeks who are interested in these fields mean that you can debate or like really get into the nitty gritty with someone that'll either point you to a project that you haven't seen, or someone who's writing about something that's urgent for you. So for sure, the best side of doing this reading is like when it feels like someone's speaking my language and you're like, yes, I'm not so alone. So that's part of the benefits, I think. And then the opportunity, and this is what I meant by this owing and this vigilance, is that by making all these points of tension visible, apparent, and through the lens of who participants will be, whether they were from the project or the larger, I mean, I'm interested to speak to movement stakeholders throughout Montreal and potentially from there, is that so the terms of the archive become dictated by their experiences, right? Whether that's what is going to be the language, what are the key pieces. Aziz would say, like a flyer is as important, if not more, than the video documentation of that event, right? And the
That's
memory.
true for a lot of movement.
Yeah, the memory lives in objects, but also in the people. So while I'm less tied to an oral history project as my discipline, again, I sort of feel like these artistic practices keep these histories alive. I am in the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling here, and this commitment, I guess I would say, to people's stories as the method is very rich and invested in here. And so the opportunity is to direct some of that towards these communities and stakeholders who would like to see their histories organized in a certain way. And that's a longer term project, right? Yes. Which is also the gift of the PhD, is me leveraging resources that I can do this for a good chunk of time and not rush it, right? So it's not another output, whether it's for the center or at the same time, you know, we lose people or they move. And so it's this dance between like the urgencies of the social movement and the continuity of all these learnings.
So eventually in the future, the Social Justice Center, you think if we can
Generations of
help
fellows
in
here.
any way, you
Yeah.
So you are at your 2nd year.
I am going through these exams of debating what is art or not, but there's a lot of great pushback there, and I think this can be like considered relational too, right? The conversations that you're having after your presentation, people get excited, they point you towards a resource that you didn't know, or they reframe what you just said. Like that is helpful as another part of the method that you can host and repeat, like one of my supervisors, Louise, says, do it again and again and again, because that's the only way you're gonna learn something different about the apparatus, right? So those are sort of the opportunities in this kind of setting, I think. And coming back to the Social Justice Center, we were saying like to continue the learning beyond maybe this 1 year tenure for good reasons, but that there's also an intergenerational communication between past fellows and upcoming. Grateful. Thank you, and thanks to those who stuck through with us, Nisa.
And I wanted to read Varda's message. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation and presentation, Koby and Mustafa. I have to run now. And we still have Nisa, so online. And
You're also.
I was just writing, thank you, thank you.
Do you have any thoughts or a question before you go?
No, it was all very, very inspiring. Thank you so much. And congrats, Koby, with your work.
Thank you. And Nisa's also affiliated with the lab here. So sometimes, again, it seems people do similar projects, but through a different lens that we rub up against each other and maybe come up with some ideas. So
Yep.
thanks for coming. Cool, and that's it for the Social Justice Center series. Yay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
For joining us.
Yeah.
it's really cool.
There's a lot of food.
But it's also nice to see what everyone's doing,
Yeah.
like